Someone's Outside Part 1. The house sat on the edge of a California valley where the air never seemed to fully cool, even in October nights, and the windows, though double-paned and tinted, felt like nothing more than thin sheets of plastic separating the family inside from the vast black outside. To call it black was an understatement. It wasn't just the kind of darkness where you squint and eventually make out the outline of the trees, the faint ridge of the neighbor's fence, or the slow blink of a distant plane sliding through the sky. No, this was the type of blackness that had weight, the kind that pressed against the glass with a patient kind of insistence, as if it were waiting, crouched low, for something inside to stir. Evelyn Parker always told herself it was just California night. The way the orchard stretched for miles behind her backyard, the way the eucalyptus trees clustered at odd intervals like watchmen, the way fog sometimes rolled low across the ground until it looked like the earth itself was trying to breathe. Still, that didn't explain why she had begun to hear things at night, soft things, like the slow drag of fabric against stucco, or the deliberate crunch of gravel from the side of the house where no one should be walking. It didn't explain why her husband, Ted, had started staying later at work these last 3 weeks, and why she felt her pulse climb into her throat every time the clock pushed past 11 and the house settled into that strange hush that comes only after the children are asleep. Tonight, the hush seemed different. Heavier. The kind of hush where every creak of the house became amplified, and every shadow stretching across the lawn looked more like a figure than a trick of light. She sat by the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard, a mug of lukewarm chamomile tea untouched in her hands, staring out past her own reflection into the black outside. That was when she realized, clear as day, that someone was out there. Not an animal, not a trick of her tired mind, not just a sound. Someone. Standing. Waiting. Evelyn didn't move at first. She had learned, over the years, that sudden movements in the dark had a way of confirming fears rather than dispelling them. If you gasped, if you lunged for the light switch, if you called out, sometimes that's when whatever was outside answered. So she sat still in her chair, her tea cooling further, her body rigid but her eyes locked on the black glass. She told herself what she always told herself on nights like this: it's probably nothing. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe the old irrigation system kicking on again, though she knew the gardener had fixed that 2 weeks ago. Maybe the branches of the eucalyptus dragging in the wind, though the night was dead still, the leaves unmoving, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She tried to find comfort in routine thoughts, but there was no comfort. Because even through the glass, even through the faint glare of her own reflection, Evelyn could swear she saw the outline of a man. Tall, thin, too still for anything natural. He wasn't standing at the edge of the property either, he was closer. Right past the swing set, near the patch of dirt where the grass refused to grow. The place Ted always said he'd reseed but never did. The figure wasn't doing anything. Just standing. Watching. Waiting. Her pulse quickened, and the air in the room seemed thicker, hotter. She turned her head just enough to glance down the hallway toward the kids' rooms, their doors shut tight, the faintest glow of nightlights seeping through the cracks beneath. The thought of them, little Danny with his dinosaur pajamas, Emily with her stuffed rabbit clutched close, made her throat dry. She wanted to protect them, but from what? From who? She tried to remember if she'd locked the back door tonight. She usually did, but the memory wouldn't come. Her mind played tricks, flipping through the evening like a faulty film reel, making dinner, helping Emily with her math homework, listening to Danny's story about recess, tucking them in, kissing them goodnight. Then tea, then the chair, then the glass door. Had she slid the lock into place? Or had she left it, God forbid, slightly ajar, like she sometimes did when she wanted a bit of cool night air drifting through the screen? Her heart began to pound with each possibility, each forgotten detail. Slowly, carefully, she set the mug down on the side table and rose from the chair, her bare feet making the faintest whisper against the hardwood. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even sway as a normal person might when trying to keep balance. It was as if it had been carved there, cut straight from the night. She took a step closer to the glass, breath shallow, every nerve alight, and in that quiet moment she realized something more terrifying than the figure itself. If there truly was someone out there, then they had been there for a while, maybe longer than she had been sitting and staring. They had been patient. Watching. And now they knew that she knew. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the sliding door handle. She told herself it was just curiosity, that she wasn't planning to open it, that she just needed to feel the cold metal under her fingers, grounding her in reality. But reality had a way of slipping through her fingers tonight, like sand in a storm. As she gripped the handle, her reflection wavered in the glass, not quite hers. The dim kitchen light behind her cast shadows that bent her face into something unfamiliar, elongated in a way that made her stomach twist. And then, very slowly, she saw it. A shift in the figure outside. A subtle movement, so slight it could have been wind, or a trick of the eye, but Evelyn knew the difference. Her breath caught in her throat as the outline turned, just enough for her to see a pale glint in what must have been eyes. Eyes that weren't reflecting anything, just absorbing the light and spitting it back as a void. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to call Ted, to do anything, but her legs felt rooted, as if the house itself had seized her in place. She realized she was holding her breath, counting heartbeats, each thump in her chest echoing louder than the last. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, once, twice, but it didn't seem to make the figure flinch. It didn't move at all. That's when the thought hit her like a hammer. This wasn't someone wandering by accident. This was deliberate. This was stalking. She thought of all the stories she'd heard on the news, the California headlines about home invasions, kidnappings, the rare but chilling murders that happened in quiet suburbs. And she thought of the streets, the endless grid of houses all around her, each lit and warm inside, and how vulnerable it made them all. And then she realized something else. The figure knew exactly where they were. Had always known. And for weeks, maybe longer, it had been circling, watching, waiting for the right night when the family would be alone. Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities, and each one was worse than the last. She thought about calling 911, but what could she say? There's a man, or something, outside my window. Standing. Watching. It sounded insane. It sounded like a nightmare she'd be laughed at for the rest of her life. And yet, her gut screamed that it was real, more real than anything she'd ever faced. Her thoughts darted to the children again, and her maternal panic surged. She had to do something. She had to protect them. Slowly, carefully, she stepped backward, moving toward the kitchen drawer where the old camping knife Ted kept, the one they joked about never using, the one that felt useless against something that could just appear. She kept her eyes on the shadowed figure outside the glass, and when she glanced away for just a moment toward the kids' room, she swore she saw the silhouette of the figure appear in another window, across the yard, staring in as if the house itself had betrayed her. Her skin crawled. Her chest heaved. And in that instant, Evelyn understood the full extent of what she was up against. This wasn't a man, not really. It was something more patient, something that studied, something that waited for fear to bloom fully before it made its move. And the worst part? She didn't know what it wanted. Evelyn pressed her back against the counter, the knife heavy in her trembling hand, and tried to focus on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the ceiling fan, the tiny groan of the floorboards under the weight of the house settling into the night, but the silence outside, the vast oppressive quiet, made every sound inside feel amplified, unnatural, urgent. Her gaze flicked to the sliding glass door again, and her stomach dropped. The figure had moved closer. Not running, not rushing, but shifting with that impossible, patient grace that defied all logic. It was near the corner of the patio now, the outline of a hand, or something like a hand, trailing along the edge of the brickwork as if measuring, calculating, marking the ground. The darkness was alive around it, twisting and stretching the edges of the lawn, making the figure seem taller, thinner, almost skeletal. Evelyn's mind scrambled for reasons, for excuses, for any explanation that didn't involve calling the police and declaring herself insane, but none came. She could feel the panic rising, coiling around her ribs, tightening like iron bands. And then she heard it, a soft, deliberate noise that made her freeze completely. Not a footstep, exactly. Not a scrape or a thud. Something between a whisper and a scrape, the faintest sound of movement that carried a rhythm, like the figure was pacing just beyond the glass, keeping time with some secret beat that only it could hear. Evelyn's skin prickled. Her ears strained to catch more, to make sense of it, but it didn't matter. Whatever it was there. It existed in the dark outside her kitchen, a being of patience, of intent. She thought of the children again. Danny, asleep with his small chest rising and falling, dreaming of dinosaurs or playgrounds or something normal. Emily, clutching her stuffed rabbit, dreaming perhaps of clouds or stars, anything that didn't include the shape looming outside. The thought twisted her gut. She had to act. But how? She couldn't confront it, couldn't risk opening the door. She couldn't run without alerting it to her movements, couldn't hide without knowing where it was. The knife felt small, insignificant in her hand, a flimsy talisman against the unseen. She edged backward toward the hallway, every nerve screaming, every shadow in the room threatening to leap into life. Her mind raced with plans. Call Ted, run to the bedrooms, barricade the doors, but the figure was patient. Patient and relentless. And in that moment, she realized something even more horrifying. It had already learned her patterns. It knew she would come to the glass, it knew she would hesitate, it knew she would consider escape and calculate every possibility. And it was waiting for her to make the wrong move, waiting for that perfect moment to strike. Evelyn wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to break the weight of the night pressing down on her, but fear had stolen her voice, left her mute and trembling. She watched as the figure finally shifted again, and for a fraction of a second, she saw what could only have been a smile, or the suggestion of one, curving along the shadowed features. It wasn't human, she thought. It couldn't be. Humans don't move like this, don't wait like this, don't take pleasure in being seen and feared at the same time. And yet, here it was outside her home, staring in, testing her, learning her. Evelyn realized that whatever came next, whatever was about to happen, she had no choice but to face it. Evelyn's mind raced as she inched down the hallway, trying to create some distance between herself and the glass door, yet every step felt measured, slow, as if she were moving through water. The knife remained clutched in her hand, its weight grounding her only just enough to keep from collapsing in panic. The house seemed alive now, not with the comfort of family life, but with an unnatural consciousness that matched the patience outside. Every floorboard groan, every distant drip from the kitchen faucet, every sigh of the walls as the night deepened, the house seemed to be watching with her, complicit in her terror, echoing the rhythm of her pounding heart. She could hear the faintest scratch against the patio, like nails dragging lightly across brick, and it was enough to make her freeze entirely. The figure had moved again. Not closer, not yet, but it had shifted, and Evelyn could sense the intelligence in the motion, a deliberate adjustment, as though it was calculating her every reaction. Her thoughts swirled chaotically. Maybe it wasn't human, she thought. Maybe it was some animal, mutated or deformed, hunting on instinct, but instinct doesn't wait, doesn't calculate, doesn't enjoy the slow crescendo of fear. No, this was deliberate, malicious, sentient, and she could feel it in her bones. She thought of the old stories Ted used to tell around the campfire, tales of travelers who vanished in the forests or along lonely California roads, stories of shapes glimpsed at the edge of the property line, waiting. She had always scoffed, laughed nervously at his exaggeration. Now, though, she realized those stories weren't exaggeration, they were warnings. And the warnings had come too late. Her legs carried her down the hallway to the children's rooms, each step carefully measured so as not to alert whatever it was outside. She peeked into Danny's room first. He was asleep, as if untouched by the creeping horror around them, oblivious to the danger inches beyond the glass. Emily, too, lay curled in her bed, the rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. Evelyn exhaled slowly, relief mingling with panic. She couldn't leave them. She couldn't face it alone. The thought of trying to barricade the sliding door seemed absurd. The figure outside had already proven it was patient, intelligent, observant. A flimsy lock and a heavy door would not stop it. She considered calling Ted again, but the phone signal seemed weak, unreliable. And even if he came home in time, what could he do? How could he confront something he had never seen, something that didn't move like a human, that waited like a predator, that seemed to toy with her fear. She pressed her palm to the wall, feeling the vibrations of her own heartbeat, and listened. Outside, the sound of dragging, soft, deliberate, almost ceremonial, continued. The figure was pacing now, circling, marking, plotting. Evelyn could feel the malevolence emanating from it, a chill that seeped through the thick glass and settled in her chest. She knew it was only a matter of time before it made a move, before it tested her courage in a way that could endanger the children. And in that moment, as fear sharpened her senses to a piercing edge, she understood the unthinkable. Whatever was outside, it wasn't just observing them. It was learning them, learning the rhythms of their lives, the patterns of their safety, the cracks in their routine. And now, with night thick around the house and the shadows pressing in, Evelyn realized she would have to face it. Not as a mother protecting her children, not as a frightened human, but as a calculated force herself, because the darkness outside had no mercy, no hesitation, and it would not wait. Evelyn took a deep, shuddering breath and forced herself to move back toward the kitchen, toward the glass door that had become the focal point of her fear. Each step felt like a gamble, each creak of the floor a signal she was broadcasting to whatever waited outside. The knife was heavy in her hand, but she clung to it as if it were a talisman against the impossible. Outside, the figure had stopped moving, and that stillness was worse than any motion could be. The absence of movement meant awareness, meant calculation, meant intent. Evelyn could feel it, an almost physical pressure pressing against her chest, a sensation like someone, or something, was peering into her very soul, cataloging every heartbeat, every flicker of fear. She tried to remind herself of reason, of logic, of all the mundane explanations she could conjure, but none of them fit. The way the figure had shifted, the way it had paced, the eerie calm it carried, none of it was human. And yet, she could see the faint outline of features, pale, elongated, impossibly thin, eyes dark, unreflective, observing. The mind scrambled for understanding, for a way to rationalize, but Evelyn knew rationalization was useless here. Panic prickled at her spine, but she pushed it down, pushed it into a corner, because panic would get her, and the children, killed. Slowly, painstakingly, she approached the door. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, eyes wide, face pale, mouth tight. She thought of Ted again. He had always been her anchor, the one who told her everything would be okay. But tonight he was gone, working late on some project he had promised to finish, leaving her to confront whatever terror had crept from the darkness into their backyard. The thought made her stomach knot, her hands tighten around the knife. Outside, the figure shifted again. Not forward. Not backward. Just a tilt of the head, a deliberate study, an almost human gesture that made her skin crawl. She realized, with a sick twist of understanding, that it was aware she was aware, and that awareness alone gave it power. She had no idea how long it had been out there, how long it had been watching, and whether it had witnessed her family's routines for days, weeks, months. She thought of every minor lapse, the unlocked side door, the screen slightly ajar, the lights left on or off, and a terrifying conclusion solidified. This thing had learned them, adapted to them, integrated into the pattern of their lives. It was no longer outside the house. In some incomprehensible way, it was part of the rhythm of the house itself, a ghostly extension of every shadow, every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees. Evelyn's mind raced, running through every horror story she had ever read or heard, every nightmare she had ever imagined, but none of them had prepared her for this. She felt the weight of inevitability settle over her. The figure outside wasn't just patient, it was eternal, a presence that could wait indefinitely for the right moment. And tonight, it had decided the moment was now. She gritted her teeth and pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the faint chill that seemed to seep through, and whispered under her breath, a prayer or a plea, she wasn't sure. Please, not tonight. Please, not tonight. The figure did not respond. It did not flinch. It merely waited as it always had, and the night deepened around her, thick, oppressive, endless. Evelyn's hands shook so violently now that the knife felt almost useless, a fragile extension of her own fear. She pressed her forehead to the glass, trying to make herself smaller, trying to become invisible, to hide from whatever watched her from the darkness. The figure outside remained impossibly still, its presence somehow magnified by the black void of the night, by the lack of any other distraction, by the silence that had grown thick and suffocating. She tried to reason, tried to convince herself that it had to leave, that it had to be human and therefore fallible, but her body didn't believe it. Her heart hammered so loud she thought it might be audible through the walls. And then, as if sensing that fear had reached its peak, the figure moved, but not in the way she expected. It didn't approach the door, didn't knock, didn't even wave or make a sound. Instead, it vanished. Simply vanished. Evelyn blinked, unsure if the night had swallowed it or if her eyes had betrayed her. The darkness outside seemed intact, whole, undisturbed, yet she knew it was lying. She knew it hadn't left. Her instincts screamed that it had only changed its method, that the patient terror of hours had evolved into something more immediate, something closer. And then she heard it. Not a scream, not a whisper, not a drag of footsteps, but a faint, deliberate tapping. Against the window. One tap. Then another, slower this time, deliberate. Her stomach flipped. Her lungs seized. She wanted to run, to flee into the hall and barricade herself with the children, but every muscle refused to obey. The tapping continued, rhythmic, as if counting out her life in small increments. She pressed her ear against the glass, straining, listening, hearing the faintest undercurrent of a breath, a presence, a reminder that she was being watched in ways she could not comprehend. Then, a sound came from inside the house, a creak, a whisper of movement from the kitchen cabinets, and Evelyn realized with dawning horror that whatever was outside, it had found a way to infiltrate the space she thought was safe. The hair on her arms stood on end. She wanted to scream, to shout for Ted, to call out to her children, but a paralyzing dread stopped her voice cold. Her mind raced, piecing together possibilities that made no sense yet felt entirely plausible in the oppressive, unnatural night. Something about the figure defied reason. It had no form that could be pinned down, no face that could be read, no motive that could be rationalized. It was not human, yet it understood fear, it fed on it, it adapted to it, it anticipated it. Evelyn's mind whirled, desperate for a plan, desperate for a way to save herself, her children, her home, but there was none. All she could do was watch, wait, and hope that whatever was out there made a mistake. She thought of the night before, the week before, all the ordinary moments that had led to this extraordinary terror, and realized with a chilling clarity, the figure outside hadn't appeared tonight. It had always been there. Always waiting. Always learning. And now it was patient no longer. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, a punctuation in the night that spelled her name without words. And Evelyn knew, with the icy certainty of fear that grips the soul, that nothing would ever be the same. Not the children, not the house, not her. And as the clock in the hall ticked past midnight, she realized the horrifying truth. Whatever was outside was no longer content to watch. Tonight it would engage. The first thing Evelyn noticed when she dared to open her eyes was the silence. Not the ordinary kind of night silence, the one you could imagine in an empty street or a quiet house, but a silence so absolute it seemed to smother the air itself. She blinked against the faint kitchen light, half expecting the figure to be waiting just outside the glass, a shadow pressed against the doorframe. But there was nothing. Nothing but darkness and the faint reflection of her own wide, terrified eyes staring back at her from the window. Her limbs ached from tension, her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular bursts, and yet she knew better than to relax. Something had changed. The figure had not left. It never left. And the knowledge burrowed into her brain like an invasive root, twisting with each heartbeat. Slowly, carefully, she rose from the floor, the knife clutched in both hands now, fingers trembling so violently that she could barely hold it steady. Every creak of the floor sounded amplified in the hush of the night. She tiptoed toward the sliding door, not sure what she would do when she reached it, only knowing that she could not sit still any longer. A faint breeze brushed against the glass, almost teasing her, and she realized with a shock that the sliding door had been unlocked after all. It had not been her mistake. Someone, or something, had undone the lock. The realization made her stomach lurch, A cold spiral of fear that hit her spine and lingered there. Outside, the yard lay in shadow, deep, oppressive, impossible to read, yet every instinct screamed that the figure was there. Watching. Studying. Waiting. Her breath caught as a branch scratched faintly against the side of the house, and she flinched, her pulse hammering in her ears. There was a rhythm to it, she realized, almost musical in its precision. It wasn't random, it was orchestrated. A warning, or a countdown, she couldn't tell. She pressed her palm to the cool glass, trying to steady herself, and saw the faintest movement in the corner of her vision. Not the figure itself, not yet, but the shadows around the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating, bending in ways that defied logic, as if the night itself had become pliable, responding to the presence that had been patient for so long. Evelyn swallowed, forcing herself to remain composed, because the moment she lost control of her fear, she knew it would strike. She thought of the children again, Danny and Emily, blissfully unaware of the terror surrounding them, and the spike of protective instinct gave her strength. She would not let it touch them. Not tonight. Not ever. Slowly, she slid the door open just a fraction, enough to see the faint outline of the patio and the yard beyond. The figure was there. It had returned, or perhaps it had never left. She couldn't tell. The outline was thinner than any human should be, elongated and slightly distorted, like it had been stretched between dimensions. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't breathe. And yet, Evelyn could feel its awareness, a palpable pressure that pressed against her chest, pulled at her consciousness, demanded attention, demanded fear. She realized that fear was its fuel, and the longer she hesitated, the more power it gained. She forced her jaw tight, holding the knife steady, and whispered a prayer she barely believed. Stay away. Don't touch them. Not tonight. And for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed to shimmer, to waver in the darkness, like it was considering her plea. Then the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound of scraping gravel from the side of the house, deliberate, patient. Evelyn's heart sank. It was circling, learning, waiting for her next move. And tonight, she knew, it would not wait forever. Evelyn took a cautious step back, leaving the door cracked open just enough to keep a line of sight on the yard, while every fiber of her body screamed that standing still would be suicide. The figure outside had not moved, but its presence was heavier somehow, more tangible, as if it had seeped into the night itself, bending shadows and drawing the darkness into a solid, suffocating shape. Her fingers clenched the knife, knuckles white, and she tried to steady her breathing, inhaling slowly, exhaling with effort, forcing her mind to focus on logic, on strategy. But the logic failed her. Nothing about this was logical. The figure defied physics, defied reason, defied everything she had ever learned about the world. Its thin, elongated silhouette seemed to stretch across the lawn, twisting subtly in ways that made the grass and the trees behind it shiver, like reality itself was bending around its form. She forced herself to recall what she knew: children asleep, house secure, well, as secure as it could be with something like this watching. She pressed herself against the counter, listening, counting heartbeats, counting steps, calculating movements. The figure made no sound, yet she knew it was aware, calculating in turn, anticipating, adapting. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The shadow shifted, just slightly, and the glint of its eyes caught a stray beam of light from the kitchen lamp. The glint was not human. It was dark, like a void, reflecting nothing and consuming everything, and in that instant, Evelyn felt the raw, unfiltered weight of its focus. Her body tensed as adrenaline surged. She thought about escape, about barricading the door, about fleeing with Danny and Emily into the bedrooms, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. This presence didn't respond to ordinary barriers, didn't react to conventional defenses. It observed, it waited, it studied, and it had already marked her movements. Every thought, every hesitation, every instinct had been catalogued. The fear she felt now, she realized, was exactly what it wanted. She considered the knife again, and the absurdity of it made her stomach churn. One human blade against a being that could vanish and reappear at will? Against a patience older than she could comprehend? against a darkness that had seeped into the corners of her mind? It was laughable if the circumstances weren't so lethal. But Evelyn had no choice. She couldn't let it near the children. She couldn't let it linger in the backyard like some malevolent ghost. Every muscle in her body screamed to act, to do something, anything, even if futile. She stepped closer to the door, her reflection trembling against the glass, and whispered again, this time louder, more desperate, "Go away. Leave us alone." The wind shifted, and she heard it again, the faintest whisper of movement, almost imperceptible, like gravel scratching across concrete, circling the house, outside the line of sight, closer, just beyond perception. Her heart slammed in her chest. She realized, with gut-wrenching clarity, that it wasn't just outside anymore. It was at the threshold of the house, in the very shadows that lined the patio, moving in ways her mind refused to fully comprehend. It had learned, adapted, and now it was ready. Evelyn backed into the kitchen, knife raised, trembling, and pressed her palms against the doorframe, trying to anchor herself in the thin line between courage and terror. She could feel the presence growing, pressing against the glass, against her, against the house itself. And she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that whatever came next, there would be no turning back. That Evelyn's pulse raced as she scanned the backyard again, every shadow a potential threat, every tree a possible hiding place for the thing that had infiltrated her peace. Her reflection in the sliding glass door trembled as if mocking her, and for a moment, she almost imagined it wasn't her own face staring back. The figure had shifted once more, though subtly, almost imperceptibly, and the knowledge that it could move without sound, without notice, made her stomach twist into knots. Her mind reeled with possibilities. Did it know the layout of the house? Had it studied the paths she and the children took from bedroom to kitchen? Did it know how she would react to fear, to panic, to the sound of her own heartbeat? Every instinct told her that this was no ordinary intruder. It was something more calculated, more patient, more aware than anything she had ever encountered. She forced herself to step closer to the cracked door, gripping the knife tightly, knuckles whitening as the cool metal pressed into her palm. Outside, the darkness seemed to pulse in time with her fear, ebbing and contracting as though the night itself were alive, responding to the presence she could not see fully, yet knew was there. She whispered again, almost in desperation, a soundless plea to whatever waited, "Please, not my children. Not them." And for a terrifying heartbeat, she thought she saw movement, not the figure directly, but the shadows it commanded, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against her skin, making her shiver violently, and she realized she could feel the thing before she could see it. It was there, at the edges of perception, at the very threshold of the house, waiting for her next mistake. Evelyn's mind scrambled for strategy, for any plan that would keep the children safe. Could she lure it away? Could she distract it? Could she? No, she realized with horror, none of it would work. Its patience and intelligence far surpassed her own. She considered calling Ted one last time, but the phone's line was dead, the battery fading, and she understood that he would not arrive in time. Panic clawed at her, but she swallowed it, forcing herself to remain composed. She had to think, had to survive, had to protect her children. The tapping started again, soft, deliberate, coming from a corner of the yard just beyond the sliding door. She froze, every nerve screaming. It was a countdown, a rhythm, a message she could not interpret, and yet it was unmistakable. She pressed herself against the doorframe, raising the knife in a defensive gesture, praying that it was enough, that her presence, her will, could somehow repel this malevolent force. And then she saw it, or rather, glimpsed the distortion where it had been, a thin, elongated shape moving with impossible speed across the patio, bending shadows, melting into the darkness like it had never been fully solid at all. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The figure had crossed the threshold of her perception, had violated the safe line of her home. And she knew, in that instant, that the next moments would define everything: survival, fear, and the stark realization that this thing outside had been waiting its entire life, or eternity, for tonight. She tightened her grip on the knife, and whispered, barely audible, "Come on then. Do what you will. But not them." Evelyn's body ached with tension as she stood frozen by the sliding glass door, knife trembling in her hands, her eyes straining to catch the faintest hint of movement in the darkness beyond. The night had thickened, the shadows deepened, folding the backyard into a landscape she no longer recognized, a terrain designed for fear itself. She could feel the figure's presence everywhere at once, at the edge of the patio, in the blackness beyond the trees, even in the corners of her own kitchen, as if it had become the night itself, an extension of the darkness that pressed relentlessly against her senses. The tapping started again, deliberate, measured, echoing like some sinister heartbeat that synchronized with her own, and Evelyn realized with a shiver that the entity had learned her rhythm, her fear, her hesitation, and was using it against her. She pressed herself tighter to the doorframe, knife raised, a fragile barrier against the impossible, as a sudden movement outside caught her eye, a flicker, a bend in the shadow that made her stomach plummet. The figure had shifted again, closer this time, bending the shapes of the yard to its will, the trees stretching unnaturally, the grass flattened as if marking a path only it could traverse. Evelyn's pulse hammered so loudly she thought it might echo through the house, and she realized she could no longer discern the difference between what was real and what the darkness had created. Then, almost imperceptibly, a sound came from behind her, not from the yard, but from inside the house, a faint, deliberate creak of the floorboard, a whisper of movement that was impossibly close. Her breath caught. It was probing, testing, learning. Evelyn whirled toward the sound, heart hammering, and saw nothing, but knew instinctively that presence, the same oppressive awareness, had entered the space, had crossed the threshold without opening a door, without leaving a trace. Her thoughts collided in panic, logic and terror tangled impossibly. The children's faint breathing came from the bedrooms down the hall, each exhale a reminder of what she had to protect, and a fresh wave of adrenaline surged through her, giving her a momentary edge over the terror that sought to consume her. She took a cautious step toward the hallway, toward the bedrooms, knife ready, senses straining to detect the impossible. Outside, the figure moved again, not with a step, but with a ripple through the shadows, a bending of the darkness itself that defied explanation. Evelyn's throat tightened as she realized the final truth. Whatever this was, it was not bound by human limitations. It did not need doors, windows, or walls. It had already infiltrated every corner of her life, every edge of her perception, and now, it was ready to finish what it had begun. She forced herself to focus, to plan, to act, because hesitation now meant more than fear, it meant doom. The tapping intensified, closer, faster, a rhythm that matched the rising panic in her chest. Evelyn raised the knife high, whispering a plea, a prayer, a declaration of intent. Not them. Never them. The shadows seemed to pause, then ripple violently as the entity moved forward, bending the world around it, closing in on her, pressing the night into a tangible shape that threatened to swallow her whole. And in that unbearable instant, Evelyn knew that what came next would define the night, define her family, define her own survival. There was no more time to hesitate. Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle as the darkness pressed closer, but she forced herself upright, knife clutched like a lifeline, every nerve taut with terror and determination. Outside, the figure shifted again, impossibly fluid, bending the shadows, stretching the yard into something unrecognizable, almost like the night itself had become an extension of its will. She could see the glint of those impossible eyes, void-like, absorbing every reflection, every fragment of light, every heartbeat of fear radiating from her. The tapping stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She could feel it, moving closer, not with footsteps, not with motion she could understand, but as if the darkness itself were encroaching, folding around her, seeking her, testing her will. Evelyn's breath came in ragged bursts. She pressed herself against the counter, staring at the sliding glass door, calculating the impossible, how to protect herself, her children, her home, when her opponent was not bound by ordinary rules. And then she saw it. The figure, or what could be called a figure, materializing fully in the faint glow of the kitchen light, elongated limbs bending at impossible angles, eyes voided, a face that was a suggestion rather than a form, a presence that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Evelyn tightened her grip on the knife, every muscle screaming with terror, and in that moment she understood. It was not merely outside, it was in her mind, in the house, in every corner, in every shadow. She whispered a vow, a promise, a desperate prayer. Not them. Never them. The figure hesitated, or at least something resembling hesitation, a subtle ripple in the darkness, and in that tiny fraction of time, Evelyn acted. She slammed her body against the doorframe, pushed herself forward, brandished the knife, and shouted with everything she had, a scream that carried terror, defiance, and maternal fury all at once. For a heartbeat, the world froze, the air thick, the shadows stretched, the impossible presence paused. And then it recoiled. Not fully, not gone, but momentarily unsettled, the rhythm of its movements disrupted by the sudden assertion of her will. Evelyn didn't wait to understand, didn't pause to question the impossible. She backed toward the hallway, toward the children's rooms, knife ready, heart hammering, every nerve alive with fear and determination. She grabbed Danny first, then Emily, clinging to them, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. The shadows seemed to pulse, the figure outside bending, twisting, but something had changed. It had recognized her courage, her defiance, and for now, it retreated, melting into the night with the patience that defined it, vanishing without a trace, leaving the backyard dark but empty. Evelyn held her children close, knees weak, body trembling, and for the first time, allowed herself a single breath, a fragile exhale of relief. The house was quiet now, the night still, the shadows ordinary once more. She didn't know if it would return, didn't know if it had learned, didn't know if the night would ever be safe again. But for now, she had survived. She had protected her children. She had faced the impossible. And she understood with a deep, unshakable certainty that the darkness was patient, eternal, and that it would never forget. Evelyn hugged her children tight, whispered promises of safety she prayed would hold true, and waited, knowing that the night, and whatever had been outside, would continue to watch, wait, and learn, until the next moment it chose to test her again.